Good evening, and I promise that this second part will be slightly more concise and less long-winded than the previous, and hopefully a little bit more digestible and user-friendly. Um, so I'm going to recap briefly the previous video's key points. We're going to go through the last of the spi-m modeling summary at a much greater speed, I hope. And I'm going to give a quick summary of those points before rounding off the video. And at that point, hopefully we'll have a good baseline for understanding, well, you may infer from this model, from this paper, to some degree. You may draw your own inferences about where the thinking of experts was at the time prior to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so without further ado, key points. Pandemics are studied relative to, or have been studied relative to, historic influenza pandemics of the 20th century. Children are typically big spreaders because they haven't seen as many strains of influenza as adults. Their immune systems aren't as adapted. Travel restrictions provide minor delays at best after the pandemic has spread beyond a small area and have to be very strict to have much impact. Pandemics will have a pandemic will have set in all over the UK by the time we notice that it's here, but typically slightly out of sync for different population centres, with large travel hubs like London getting a head start because of additional initial exposure. Once it's arrived in the UK, attempts to contain it are almost certain to fail. The elderly and infants typically have a higher pandemic influenza mortality, but the age profile is variable. Particularly Spanish flu is a good point of that one. Contact tracing and testing are vital to knowing what the key parameters of a pandemic are. For example, percentage asymptomatic, fatality probability, transmission patterns as distributed by age, risk group, etc. Work absenteeism at the peak could be around 17 to 20%. Antibiotics can reduce mortality from secondary infections but don't affect transmission. Antivirals can protect people from getting influenza but only while they're being taken. Can help. I shouldn't say it's like an absolute protection. It can help to a strong degree. Antivirals can reduce the time someone is infectious for reducing their ability to pass it on. Advice is that antivirals be used to shorten infection times of sick people and possibly targeted use for vulnerable groups, exposed households or essential workers. Otherwise, you'll just end up running out before the population has built up immunity and you'd get a second wave. Even poorly matching influenza vaccines can have a big effect if used early on, but you have to have the right type in stock and ready to go at the start of a pandemic. And you'd probably want to target your vaccination at children and the elderly. And now we'll jump straight into this new set of this back into this wonderful document we know as a spi-m modeling summary. And I think we had just about got to social distancing, surprise, surprise. So we'll try and start off around there. In addition to the medical countermeasures of vaccination, antivirals, and antibiotics, various social distancing measures might be used to reduce interpersonal contacts, reduce transmission, and hence the progress and extent of the epidemic. Two such measures are restrictions on mass gatherings and school closures of various kinds, individual classes, local, regional, national, preemptive, scheduled, or reactive. So there's quite a menu of different options there, and it's worth kind of looking at them. Individual classes would be literally just looking at closing individual classes in schools rather than whole schools, and that's kind of what's happened in this pandemic. Certain classes have been allowed to remain open, but those are artificial classes that have been kind of composed of the children of essential workers and children who are deemed to be in some way vulnerable. Um, you could have closures of schools in certain local areas and not others. You could have closures of certain regional areas or on a national level. And you don't necessarily have to close the schools all at once. You could have scheduled closures where you just extend the school holidays or add an extra school holiday in. Or you could have reactive closures where, for example, you close a school for a certain period of time every time there is a student in the school who becomes a confirmed case of the pandemic. And yeah, there's quite a menu of options there. They only, well, we'll see, but they go on to consider mainly just the one. The impact of any intervention, including closing schools, depends critically on the mixing between children and adults, as well as the age dependence on background immunity. Again, the assumption is that adults have typically had exposure to quite a number of different influenza strains, and elderly adults more so. And so, ironically, even though elderly adults are more at risk because they tend to have very poor outcomes, um, children tend to get influenza much more, and because they haven't had the prior exposure to build up a resistance to a range of different strains and types. And of course, influenza is one of those diseases where if you've seen a similar strain before, even if it's not identical enough to provide you with total immunity, you can have a resistance, which can shorten the course of the disease or make it harder for you to get the disease in the first instance. And of course, in Corona, you don't have that. No one's seen a novel coronavirus before. There's no history of that. On the other hand, if there was significant background immunity amongst adults, there may be more a more considerable impact on the pandemic. For example, in the UK in 2009 pandemic, school holidays, possibly in combination with general summer holidays, suppressed the epidemic over August. So that is actually something that we think in the last pandemic, one of the reasons that we think there probably was a bit of a second wave in 2009 was school holidays kicked in, suppressed things temporarily, and then they ended and it came back again a bit. However, to be used successfully as a suppression strategy, closures would need to be maintained until pandemic-specific vaccines were available. So again, you do tend to get these second waves, and if you ease up, you do expect to get a second wave. You do expect to get a resurgence. In fact, there's some in the literature. There's some indications that potentially, if you do things wrong, you can actually get an outcome where it's worse to do the intervention. An intervention that's begun and then ended prematurely can, under certain circumstances, in certain models, produce an impact that is actually worse, is less beneficial than simply doing nothing. So yes, and of course vaccines take a long time to be available. Traditionally, vaccines have almost never been useful in any pandemic, not to a major degree. School closure is therefore most usefully employed if children are particularly badly affected, or if is known to be significant background immunity in adults. The impact of any school closure policy would depend on timing and length of school closures in the specific circumstances of the epidemic. However, in the case of mitigating rather than suppressing an epidemic, closing schools reactively after a case of flu in the school for 3 weeks produces almost the same effect as longer or more widespread closures. However, a school may have to close a number of times under such a policy, and longer or more widespread closures may be more practical. As noted above, absences directly due to illness could peak at up to 17% for 2 to 3 weeks at the height of the epidemic. Under the same reasonable worst-case assumptions for a typical organization, additional absences due to those who need to stay at home to look after ill children might further increase absences from 17 to 20%. However, if schools were closed, absences due to those staying at home to look after children could rise to 15 to 20% throughout the period of school closure. So basically, you're going to have a lot of people off work if you close schools, is what they're saying, and I think that's definitely been proven to be true in this current climate. Independently to the extent and severity of the epidemic. In an epidemic approaching the reasonable worst case, a total absence level, including illness and those caring for children, might approach 30 to 35% at peak, though evidence from school holidays and teachers' strikes suggests this may be an overestimate. If schools are closed, it will be important to discourage gathering of children into school-like childcare settings, example, mass childcare provisions by employers, as this would negate any health benefits of a policy. So realistically speaking, if parents are just palming their kids off onto creches or summer school programs, and that is actually one problem with closing schools around summer, is that the impact may be that lots of kids end up going on holiday to resorts, or they end up going into summer schools or summer programs. They don't get that isolation. So you have to take that into account, that the way a school closes in and out of term time is slightly different. So yeah, the isolation is kind of needed to be sustained and enforced beyond just closing school in order to be as effective as possible. Little direct evidence is available on the effects of cancelling large public events. However, the results might be expected to be similar for those for closing schools, albeit on a considerably more limited scale. Some benefit might be expected for those who would otherwise have attended the events, but very little for the overall community. Some benefit might also be expected from the reduction in travel to such events. However, the benefits of even major reductions in all travel are small. These conclusions are consistent with the lack of important observable differences between the course of seasonal flu outbreaks in London, where there is considerable mixing on commuter trains and underground railways, and the course in other parts of the UK. So I'm not entirely sure what research they're referring to there, and I'd very much like to see it. But it appears like someone did some research on how seasonal flu spreads on London's transport network, which would be fascinating to see. But their conclusion was that it doesn't seem to make much of a big difference, and it's a shame that they haven't cited that, because I'd like to read that. But even their conclusion is really it's not going to have that big an impact. And that's very much a case. Large events, if they're relatively short, don't actually give that much opportunity for people to mix. People tend to turn up to a concert and they tend to go home, and maybe they give it to the person in front of them if they have it. It can't spread throughout the whole crowd. It's not really any more serious than going down to the pub, except of course if you go down to the pub, you go down every night, whereas if you go to a concert, it tends to be like once every so often. So there's that. Um, Voluntary home isolation. People staying at home if they show flu-like symptoms will decrease the number of contacts between infected and uninfected individuals and hence is likely to decrease the spread of the infection. Well, absolutely, that's just common sense. It's a bit difficult to quantify, and again, they don't cite anything. It's worth noting the density of evidence for social distancing is poor because it's never been done before. Um, the last time social distancing was tried in a big way was the Spanish flu, which is a pre-internet, pre-commercial, regular air travel, pre-everyone has a car society where life was very, very different and social patterns of contact were very, very different. And it's really difficult to assert that evidence from those periods can be reliably transferred to the modern world. We know social distancing has an impact because it did then, but at the same time, we also know that the impact can be double-edged because some places, particularly in America, eased up on social distancing during the Spanish flu and when it started to go down, and they saw a second wave, and arguably, some modelling, some analysis suggests that they may have had worse results as a consequence of social distancing and then relaxing social distancing than if they'd just done nothing, um, which is awkward. And there's literature to support that, as I recall. I've seen papers on that. Um, Maybe we'll look them up at some point. Okay. But voluntary home isolation is pretty standard and pretty easy. It's basically just telling people if you're sick, if you've got the symptoms of a pandemic, stay home. Stay home, seek medical advice. Don't go to hospital unless you absolutely have to, because we don't want you giving it to people if you can manage it at home. That's not new. That's pretty standard for all pandemics. As you'll see, it's what they recommend you do in all pandemics. So you advise people to do that. The combined effects of social distancing measures, including closing schools, cancelling large public events, closing places of entertainment, and home isolation. So that actually they do actually speak about closing places of isolation, and that's they do speak about closing places of entertainment, and that's the only place in the entire report where they mention that. And home isolation, if started very early on in a locality affected by influenza, may have a significant impact on reducing transmission. In some US cities in the 1918 to 19 pandemic, that's the swine flu pandemic, by the way, it is thought that the combined measures reduced R to less than 1 from R naught value of 1.4 to 2. So that's basically a reduction of about 0.4 to 1 reduction in R naught. And R naught is a value that naively measures how many people tend to be infected from one person being infected. So if you get infected and the R naught value is 1.4 or 2, you would go on to infect 1.4 on average people, or 2 people on average. Got something in my eye. 1.4, 2 people on average, but only if those people were susceptible to being infected. So obviously if they had some background immunity, some prior exposure, they'd been given a vaccine, that wouldn't count. If they'd already had it, that wouldn't count. So you're operating on the assumption that the people that you're having contact with are pretty much blank pages in so far as a pandemic's concerned. And so what the R naught is quite different from the number of people actually being infected by each individual event when you get further on into the pandemic. But that's the meaning of it, in a sense. However, such measures would need to be maintained until sufficient quantities of pandemic-specific vaccine became available. In the US cities where the measures were relaxed, there was a second wave of infection, as I mentioned earlier. And that is one of the things. Their estimation is that they think they can reduce it by about 1. And I think in this particular case, the assumption about the R naught of COVID-19 is that it's in excess of 2, probably. I have to double check the figures on that, but I'm reasonably certain that it is believed to be in excess of 2. So reducing it by 1, assuming that scaled linearly, and it won't, but if it did, you're kind of looking at a pandemic that just grows much more slowly. And of course, there's a lot more modelling in the more recent papers that I believe suggests that they could get the R naught level down to 0.6 with the social distancing measures that are currently being employed, but we'll read that later on. This is just to get a background into the thinking and the practice of modelling pandemics prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. All social distancing measures depend on compliance by the population, which in turn depends on social acceptability of the measures. Without good behavioural research on these, it is difficult to predict the impact of such measures being deployed in a future pandemic. So that is absolutely true. There really isn't the evidence for this. As I say, the last time that anything even remotely like that was done on a large scale was the early 20th century, around between the First and the Second World War. And the research just doesn't exist. There has been research done more recently, and we'll go through what research has been published by the government. But there's no citation here, and there's very little citation for this social distancing research, because it's just not been looked into, and it's very much an unknown quantity. How long will the public put up with social distancing and a high level of social distancing? And it's simply an unknown quantity. Will it be a month, 2 months, 3 months? As we'll see, the earliest vaccines are expected with influenza to come to 4 to 6 months. And not in useful quantities for 8 to 12. So, yeah. We'll see. While there is a role for less disruptive social distancing measures such as voluntary home isolation in any pandemic, so you can do that and should do that in any pandemic. School closures and cancelling of public events are generally only justified in very severe pandemics because of their severe social impact over an extended period of time until the pandemic-specific vaccine becomes available. So really the only exit strategy from any kind of social distancing they see if you start using it, if you have to start using it, is a vaccine. Second waves, possible subsequent waves. Some supplies of vaccines specific to pandemic viruses may be available before a second or third wave of a pandemic if they arise. In the 2009 pandemic, vaccine only became generally available sometime after the peak of the second wave in the UK. Without the suppression effect in the holiday period, the vaccine would have arrived after the vast majority of the epidemic was over. So, yeah. Even with the suppression from the summer holidays, and 2009 was a very mild pandemic, if you could call it a pandemic at all, but that's no reason to believe that it was going to happen on a very much faster timescale, really. Even with that suppression, the vaccine was still only turned up after the majority of the people, not the majority of the people in the pandemic overall, but the majority people in the second wave of the pandemic had already got it. So for them it was completely useless. For most people it was completely useless. And if there hadn't have been that suppression and then a second wave, it would have been pretty much completely useless for anyone except particularly vulnerable groups and people who get it in a mutated, people who might get it for the flu season. Of the three pandemics of the 20th century, only that of the 1918 generally produced national epidemics with second waves, and thus only one of these pandemics would thus in only one of these pandemics would a pandemic-specific vaccine be of general value in controlling the pandemic. It is expected that vaccines specific to the pandemic virus will start to become available approximately 4 to 6 months after the start of a pandemic. Even if there is time to produce some vaccine before the start of the second wave, there may not be time to produce a large amount, which may take 8 to 12 months. Now, to be really effective in a pandemic, a vaccine has to be produced and applied at high enough levels to invoke herd immunity. That is to say, you don't have to vaccinate everyone, but you have to vaccinate enough people that the virus starts having difficulty finding places to spread to. And there's a threshold for the number of people you need to kind of have immunity for that. And yeah, so that becomes difficult to do with small quantities of vaccine. A few million doses isn't actually that much. You need to vaccinate decent-sized chunks of your population to have a big effect, or target it to small chunks, but small chunks that are very influential. Yeah. And on top of that, remember that 8 to 12 months to be useful, that's for an influenza vaccine. We make influenza vaccines all the time. We do it every year for seasonal flu. We have previous experience making influenza vaccines for pandemic flu. We have a wealth of experience about doing this. We've been planning for it for a long time. No one has ever made a corona vaccine before, as far as I'm aware, ever. Just a thought. Some limited impact will occur if a substantial quantity of vaccine becomes available within rather than before a second wave or extended first wave. The rapid final delivery to those to be immunized would be essential to obtain a significant effect. In this case, the vaccine should be targeted at those most at risk of serious illness. So basically give it to all the old people. And I'm imagining that's something to do with a rationale behind keeping all of the old people indoors, all of the old people, at-risk people with underlying health conditions indoors for a long period of time, because the notion is, well, if we can keep them healthy until the vaccine comes, then we can just immunize a lot of them and stop worrying about it. Whether that will actually be workable with so many elderly people living in residential care, where they have contact with each other and with care workers, and given that even so many old people who live in their houses have to have care workers come in to give them assistance with things, who they can't stop having that care, they need it, and the care workers can't be 100% certain that they're not asymptomatic carriers. Yeah, whether or not that's realistically viable, well, I don't know. We'll read the modelling that the government's released about this, and I'm sure we'll be able to draw some interesting conclusions. That's in the future. So they do some actual numerical modelling where they start setting out numbers in a pretty structured and organised way. We're going to go through that because that's pretty important. I want to give you a sense of kind of numerically the impact that these interventions can have. Now, they've only looked at 4 interventions and different combinations of them. The use of antivirals in a reactive sense, being given to people who've already had the disease, people who have said, I have the symptoms of this pandemic, can you help me? And I say, yes, take these antivirals. Hopefully your disease will be less severe. Hopefully your disease will clear up faster, and therefore hopefully you'll be less likely to give it to someone. It's intervention 1. Intervention 2, antibiotics. You should have a stockpile of antibiotics is the suggestion, so that you can start giving antibiotics to anyone who might be at risk of getting a secondary infection in their lungs, have a viral infection, having weakened their lungs. They then get a bacterial infection that can cause bacterial pneumonia and that can kill them. And actually, in influenza, a significant proportion of deaths are from bacterial pneumonia. Now, in corona, I'm not sure that that's such a big factor. I'm not so hot on the clinical side of all of that business, but I haven't been reading about that much in the literature. It's been more about the cytokine storms and the propensity of the virus to attack multiple organs in the body, which of course is something that influenza rarely ever does. Pre-pandemic vaccine. Now remember, that's a vaccine that is not targeted at a specific pandemic virus. It's kind of targeted at a class of influenza viruses. And if you have a pre-pandemic vaccine for the class of viruses that your pandemic happens to be a member of, it can act as a poor vaccine, a reduced quality vaccine, but even that can still have a big impact. And so, and lastly, there's household prophylaxis with antivirals. So basically, that is using antiviral medication for the entire house when one person in the house gets ill. So the assumption being, well, you might stop someone getting ill by doing that. You also might reduce the course of illnesses for anyone who's asymptomatic in that household, because even if they're asymptomatic, they can still give it to other people. And this is combined with a policy of reactive school closures, as you can read here. So they look at different combinations of these four interventions. They have a little table of how they suggest they might be combined, the different amount of stockpiles of antivirals and antibiotics that can be achieved, and pre-pandemic vaccines that you might potentially have. And we kind of look at a kind of hierarchy, a ladder of different interventions and how they could be combined together in scenarios 0 to 8, from do nothing through to throw everything in the kitchen sink at it. Throw all of those four interventions at it. So the first thing, I think we'll skip over clinical cases and hospitalizations, and let's go straight to deaths. And you can see here the death rate for the do-nothing case is between 700 to 800,000. Don't think those are 700 to 800 people. That's 700 to 800,000 deaths. And as you may recall, as I recall, the modelling from Imperial College suggested that doing nothing in the event of COVID-19 would lead to about 500,000 deaths. So the reasonable worst case scenario, and this is for the reasonable worst case, so that is a clinical attack rate of 50%. 50% of the population will get ill at some point, is the assumption. For that, you're actually looking at a worse scenario than even the current projections for doing nothing had. But the difference, of course, is you can cut that down quite a bit just by using antivirals in a reactive way. And you can cut that down even more if you also have antibiotics, plenty of antibiotics to spare. And if you happen to have a pre-pandemic vaccine as well, that cuts it down even more. So you get all these reductions in combination. But by and large, the antiviral seems to be the big one. Well, we don't have any antivirals for COVID, for corona, for SARS-CoV-2. We certainly don't have a pre-pandemic vaccine, and we don't know that antibiotics are actually that helpful. So yeah, it's not necessarily that it's so much worse than what we envisioned. We could certainly envision this happening. It's that it's just that these interventions are not really effective or an option for COVID-19 at the moment. But of course, there was always a possibility that in influenza these might have not been the options. It is possible for influenza to mutate and for it to become resistant to antivirals. Not all strains of influenza are assumed to be susceptible to all antivirals. And of course, antibiotics would always have an impact, of course. And the probability of having a pre-pandemic vaccine is very hard to gauge, and is a little bit kind of like, well, half a dozen of the other kind of thing, because there are so many different subtypes of influenza A, just of influenza A, because influenza A is itself its own subtype and is the most severe type, but the subtypes of the subtype, the H protein based classification, there's quite a lot of them. So unless you happen to have one that's just the same H protein as whatever influenza strain you get, the pre-pandemic vaccine isn't going to work. And so that's a bit of a dicey one as well. So it's certainly possible for some of these interventions not to be available in influenza pandemic, not to be useful in influenza pandemic. And as it turns out, this worst case scenario of over 700,000 deaths is very plausible even in an influenza scenario. So the notion that COVID-19 came out of nowhere and no one ever could have imagined anything this big hitting us, it's just not so. It's just absolutely not so. This is a raw clinical attack rate of 35%, so that's a slightly less aggressive pandemic. And again, you're looking at deaths in the 500,000 kind of range. So this is something about a lot closer to what Imperial College has suggested for COVID-19. And again, you still see the massive reduction you get just by using antivirals. And then with the effect of antibiotics on secondary infections on top, that makes a big drop down to the sub 200,000 cases. But even that's quite high. Even that would be considered high, for what we're currently aiming to achieve. What some projections have been claiming we might achieve with this current set of interventions. And then you get a quite weak pandemic, a pandemic of 25% clinical attack rate. Still a lot harder than the 2009 pandemic, but still. And you're looking at death rates in the kind of just under 400,000 to 350 kind of thousand range. Again, the massive drop. In fact, the weaker of a pandemic, the more the drop seems to be honest, from a purely qualitative, just eyeballing the graph point, but certainly it's a quite substantial drop. In the number of deaths. Yeah. And so that pretty much concludes the document that we're going to go through. There's a couple of things. They present a hypothetical profile of what the pandemic might look like. It's not a projection. They say in big warning notes like, important, this is not a projection. This is not a forecast. It is an illustrative kind of, its purpose is to provide a reasonable worst case for planning purposes. So these are what actual historical pandemics have looked like in terms of their shape. And you can see there's quite a lot of variation. But this is what they're suggesting for kind of like a planning purpose. And if you just take this and scale it up to have 500,000 deaths and look at under the area of this graph, you're going to see that actually it was never a surprise that you would run out of capacity in the system to deal with that. It was never a surprise. The availability of ICU beds is publicly published, and you can quite easily do the maths and figure out where on this graph that line would fall, the kind of a horizontal line, and it's not difficult to see that most of these projections, quite a lot of them, particularly the unmitigated cases, bust through that line quite easily. And even quite a few of the mitigated cases with minor mitigation, I think, could come quite close to it or bust it. So yeah, it's not a secret. It's something that anyone who just sat down and did some very simple maths could have worked out, and should have worked out, and probably did, allegedly, if you believe what's in the papers, did work out. So that kind of concludes that. And of course, there's some graphs here saying, oh yeah, you might get some variation in the steepness, the sharpness of the peak, based upon different regions having slightly different sharpnesses. Yeah. And they give a long list of references to the various papers that have been published that support this research. So, just to summarize that very quickly. The two main social distancing measures considered in this particular paper are banning mass gatherings and school closures. Usefulness of school closures is dependent on the age distribution of disease resistance. Closing schools on a case-by-case basis in response to cases could be almost as good as widespread closures. School closures could lead to 50 to 20% of work absenteeism throughout the closure period. Little direct evidence for benefit of banning public events, believed to have very little benefit for the overall community. Voluntary home isolation of symptomatic individuals is likely to have an impact. In combination, if started early, the discussed social distancing measures could reduce the rate of the spread of a virus, but would need to be maintained till a lot of vaccine was available to avoid the second wave. It's difficult to predict whether the public will comply with social distancing for long periods. There wasn't much research on this available at the time this paper was written, certainly not included in the paper. Less disruptive social distancing, like voluntary home isolation of the symptomatic, recommended for all pandemics, but school closures and cancelling public events only for severe pandemics. Lockdown policies, closing businesses, actually closing entertainment venues was briefly mentioned, but certainly closing of businesses more generally, compulsory home isolation of the non-symptomatic, so effectively don't leave your home without an excuse. It just doesn't feature anywhere in this document. It's not even discussed as an option. Most pandemics are expected to have played out before a vaccine can have any real impact. Good quality influenza vaccines expected to be available 4 to 6 months from start of pandemic, but only in useful quantities in 8 to 12 months. Modelled interventions include reactive treatment with antivirals, antibiotic stockpiles for secondary infections, poor quality vaccines at the start of pandemic, antivirals for infected households with case-by-case school closures. Unmitigated reasonable worst case is worse than current unmitigated worst case figures for SARS-CoV-2. I will confirm that when we go through the Imperial College modelling later in another video. The biggest impact on deaths seem to be from antivirals. Yeah. So it looks like we actually get to end this stream properly today. And I would like to thank you all for putting up with me and putting up with this. I hope it's of some value to you. I think we have in these two videos now achieved a kind of a baseline to go through the current modelling papers that have been published by the government in detail. And we have something to compare them with. And we have some thinking of how the state of the art may have changed in the last 2 years, because that was published 2008 sometime, 18 sometime, I believe. So yes, there's a lot to do, there's a lot to say, and I am tired and need a good night's rest, but it's convenient to do these things at night when I've got some free time and free space in the house, and I hope that this is all of benefit to you, and I look forward to continuing it later. So probably next video we'll go through Imperial College's big modelling paper, the one that prompted the lockdown, and after that we will look at, well, I don't know, we might do some mathematics, we might do some basic we might go through the mathematics of modelling pandemics very briefly, but I don't want to overcomplicate things with lots of jargon and maths too early on. And also, I think there's some appetite perhaps for social distancing and the behaviour of social distancing, because there's at least one report on that. It might be profitable to go through that. So maybe you can leave me your opinions in the comments if indeed anyone is watching these videos, because I think they are currently languishing underneath the algorithm, which is hardly surprising because I am a complete unknown who's never done anything of any importance with regards to YouTube prior to this. Anyway, have fun, stay safe, and what was it I said last video? Be informed, not in fear. Good night.